When it comes to planning a ski trip, the Walt Disney Corporation is probably one of the last things that comes to mind. But if a few things had panned out differently 50 years ago, just the opposite may have been true. While Disney is often associated with animation and theme parks, back in the 1960s, the company had ambitious plans to build out a world-class ski resort as well. But even with an incredibly powerful brand name and plenty of cash behind them, the effort completely failed. So what exactly happened with Disney's attempt at a ski resort? And how did it impact the ski world as we know it today? Well, in this video, we'll go through the story of just how close the Disney ski resort actually came to reality, the various circumstances that caused the project to fail, and why rather than continuing to try, they eventually gave up on building any sort of ski resort entirely. Finally, it wouldn't be a peak rankings video without some ski resort analysis, so we'll also go through whether the resort would have actually been competitive with other North American destinations if it had actually been built. Let's jump in. To fully understand the Disney Company's relationship with the ski world, we have to start with Walt Disney himself. Walt Disney became a huge fan of skiing as an adult. He got into the sport in the 1930s, only a few years after resorts really started to be developed in California. Mr. Disney partially funded the acquisition and development of Sugar Bowl Ski Resort, which opened in 1939. As a thank you, Sugar Bowl's owner and operator actually renamed one of the peaks after him, rechristening what was formerly Hemlock Peak as Mount Disney, a name that remains to this day. You might notice that when you visit the resort today, you'll be skiing the Disney Nose, Disney Meadows, and Donald Duck trails off the Disney Express Quad. Disney maintained a focus on skiing over the next few decades, with the company releasing The Art of Skiing, an animated Goofy cartoon that actually took place at Sugar Bowl in 1941. Walt Disney himself even played a major role in producing the opening and closing ceremonies for the 1960 Olympics, which were held at what at the time was called Squaw Valley. Disney also opened its first theme park in 1955, the now legendary Disneyland, setting the stage for the company to expand into destination experiences on top of motion picture entertainment. A few months after his stint in the Olympics in 1960, Walt Disney stepped foot into Mineral King Valley for the first time, which at the time was in the periphery of California's Sequoia National Park, but not actually in it. In the wake of an explosive 3 decades of company growth and the capital to do it, the Disney Company claims that he immediately set his sights on building a resort there. Following that visit, the Disney Company got to work on making Walt's vision a reality. Disney obtained an initial permit to build out the Mineral King Ski Resort in December 1965, just 1 month after Disney bought the land in Florida to develop what would eventually become Disney World. To really put the timeline into perspective, if everything went according to plan, Disney's ski resort would open around the same time as the theme park that's now become the most popular vacation resort in the world. The US Forest Service issued Disney a preliminary permit that gave them 3 years to complete a comprehensive resort plan. If the plan was approved by the USFS, Disney would be awarded with a permanent 30-year operating permit, basically sealing the deal for the resort to open. However, there was one major thorn in the side of Disney's plans. Only one road existed into Mineral King Valley, and at the time, it was only usable during the summer months. The permanent permit was dependent on a full-year road into the valley, which meant Disney had to figure out a way to upgrade the highway. Initially, it looked like an all-weather highway had the green light. The state of California received a federal grant for the road's construction in 1966, and the governor plans to apply for a loan to cover a good chunk of the rest of the cost. Disney received approval for their resort master plan in January 1969, just over 3 years after the preliminary permit was issued. At the time, it seemed like things were going according to plan, and the new resort, including the new all-weather road, was expected to open for the 1972-1973 ski season. However, during the 3 years that Disney was working on their master plan, environmental opposition mounted. The new all-weather highway was a sticking point. While the resort itself wasn't in National Park System land at the time, parts of the rebuilt road would have to go directly through Sequoia National Park. In addition, the Mineral King Valley was surrounded by the Sequoia National Park on 3 sides, and many believed that the site's exclusion from the national park itself was questionable. Another sticking point was the sheer size of the plan's development. The Sierra Club, which at the time was a more casually organized group of environmental enthusiasts than the lobbying powerhouse it is today, initially supported Disney's ski resort plan when it was proposed in 1965. But as the resort plan evolved to a massive footprint designed to attract 2 million people per year, they changed their mind. Around the same time the 1969 master plan was approved, the Sierra Club sued the Sequoia National Park and Sequoia National Forest, which tied the project up in the courts for 3 years. This environmental suit made it all the way to the Supreme Court in 1972, and Disney actually won, which gave them the right to resume construction. But by this time, there was another issue. Disney was facing financial constraints, brought about in large part due to the exorbitant cost of opening Disney World the previous summer, and they decided to scale down their initial plan. In addition to scaling down the size of the ski area and number of lifts, Disney abandoned plans to build a 4-season road and instead planned a 15-mile cog railway to reach the resort. The railway would use zero-emission trains and require a much narrower footprint than the previously planned all-weather highway. In addition, the delayed timeline and master plan changes meant that Disney had to jump through new regulatory hurdles to get the Mineral King Ski Resort across the finish line. The 1970s were not the same environment for developing ski resorts as the 1960s, and in addition to new approval from the US Forest Service on this amended master plan, Disney now had to produce an environmental impact statement due to a new federal law signed in 1970. Due to these circumstances, the earliest construction could theoretically resume was now 1976. Finally, despite the reduced footprint, environmental lawsuits from the Sierra Club continued, and it was unclear when they would be resolved. Importantly, the Supreme Court ruling that gave Disney the right to proceed with its construction also established that environmental groups had standing to sue the government for issuing these permits, and the Sierra Club took full advantage of this. The cog railway may have looked like a more environmentally friendly alternative to the initially proposed road on paper, but issues still arose about its legality, with the project becoming tied up in the courts. Ultimately, this confluence of factors prompted Disney to decide it had had enough. In the mid-1970s, the company decided to cut their losses on the Mineral King project and walk away from the ski resort development entirely. Shortly after Disney pulled the plug in 1978, the United States Congress signed a bill annexing Mineral King into Sequoia National Park, permanently putting an end to any potential Disney ski resort, or any ski resort at all, in this 16,000-acre area. If you're watching this video, chances are you still have skiing and riding on your mind, or you're a Disney fanatic. But if you want to join us on some decidedly non-Disney ski trips next year, we're leading several personalized group trips to the Rockies, Italy, and even Chile. Looking for a trip like this but just haven't found the group to do it with? This is your chance. Some of these trips are nearly booked almost a full season out, so if you want to secure your spot, click the link in the description below. Now, back to the video. So after they couldn't get a ski resort off the ground the first time, why didn't Disney try again? Well, it turns out they actually did. When plans for the original Mineral King Resort started to fall apart in 1971, Disney started talks with the USFS about an alternate location, and they settled on Independence Lake, which is about an hour north of Lake Tahoe. Disney announced the project publicly in 1974, and they received the initial Forest Service permit the year after. However, the Independence Lake project was once again met with local opposition. The first problem came with land ownership. While the lands that Disney wanted to develop on Independence Lake was partially owned by 2 private companies, both of which were partners on the project, the rest was owned by the US Forest Service. Disney and its partners wanted the entire resort to be on private property, so they requested a land swap with the USFS. Due to a mandatory land use plan report and the environmental impact statement requirement mentioned earlier, the USFS said the land swap likely could not occur until late 1978 or early 1979. Disney ultimately decided against this land swap in the wake of that less than ideal timeline, and in mid-1977, the company completed the requirements to submit their special use permit application without the land swap. The hope at the time was to begin construction in 1979 and open the first facilities to the public in the winter of 1982. However, because the resort was now on both private and public land, it now needed more paperwork than initially intended. Disney also faced additional hurdles, and the company now apparently needed approvals from 9 state agencies before they could even break ground on the project, with no clear path to actually getting these approvals. In the wake of all these unclear circumstances, Disney said screw it, and the company abandoned its second and final ski resort project altogether in mid-1978. So neither Disney ski resort ever got built, but what would these resorts have looked like if they existed today, and how would they have stacked up? Well, it looks like their first attempt would have been pretty darn competitive. The Mineral King Ski Resort would have been massive, with the final build calling for 27 ski lifts, including at least 2 gondolas, and 8 high alpine bowls. Disney would have had a permit to build out approximately 13,000 acres of land for ski resort development, an absolutely astronomical number, but based on our measurements, the initial resort would have been closer to 4,000 or 4,500 acres, which still would have made it the largest ski resort in California by a substantial margin at the time, and among the largest still today. The resort would have boasted a 3,700-foot vertical drop, which would have been on the significant upper end among North American ski resorts and well above every other California competitor. And while the Mineral King Resort would have been south of Mammoth, it would have started out at nearly as high of a base elevation and topped out around 11,600 feet, so snow preservation may well have been very competitive for the Sierra region and North America in general. Disney also plans 10 restaurants at the Mineral King Resort, including one at 11,000 feet in altitude near or at the top of the resort, so one could probably assume that the on-mountain facility setup would have been pretty compelling as well. Cars were to be totally excluded from the valley, similar to the setup in Switzerland's Zermatt, with a cog railway intended to bring guests directly to the resort village. So what about the second planned resort at Independence Lake? Well, it probably would have at least been competitive with the Tahoe Mountains a few hours south, but it certainly wouldn't have been quite as world-class as the Mineral King Mountain the company was forced to abandon. Disney was certainly aware of this, as evidenced by a press release from the resort that claimed it would have, quote, some of the finest beginner and intermediate ski terrain to be found anywhere in America, and terrain ideally suited for family skiing groups, which will be an essential part of the Disney market. The resort would have topped out around 9,100 feet, which, while competitive, was nowhere near as high as the original Mineral King Resort. A look at the topography of the Independence Lake region shows that the resort could have theoretically offered up to 3,500 acres of terrain, which would have been very competitive, but that its vertical drop would have practically only been around 2,000 feet, which would have been far lower than most other destination ski resorts across the country. Ultimately, the extensive pedestrian village from Mineral King probably would have been replicated to some extent, but there's a reason why Independence Lake wasn't Disney's first choice for a ski resort development, and we'd be hard-pressed to see the appeal of this location as a fly-to destination for skiing and riding alone. So while it might be easy to assume that Disney failed to enter the ski resort world because of opposition specific to its heavily commercialized brand, the truth of the matter is that the company just got into the game too late and was dealt a few bad hands that sealed the death blow. If it weren't for a bad access road, a few new state and federal environmental laws that were passed during the project's conception, and some financial troubles on the company's part during the early 70s, the Disney ski resort in all likelihood would have become a reality, whether in the world-class Mineral King form or the less competitive Independence Lake iteration. Disney had some seemingly well-thought-out plans for their winter sports concepts, but ultimately, it just wasn't meant to be. So in the wake of the extensive development efforts on the part of the company all those years ago, does Disney have any sort of ski resort footprint today? Well, yes, but not in the ways anyone would expect. As we mentioned earlier, parts of the Sugar Bowl ski resort are still named after Disney, and the company actually uses snow guns to produce mist at Disney World. The biggest physical symbol of Disney's alpine roots is probably the Matterhorn ride at Disneyland, which is clearly based on the iconic mountain that hosts Switzerland's Zermatt. But behind the scenes, Disney has actually had a very significant impact on the ski world, at least in North America. The green circle, blue square, and black diamond rating scale that's almost universally used on the continents today was actually designed by Disney for use at the initial Mineral King Resort, and the United States' National Ski Areas Association, or NSAA, officially adopted it as guidance for all the resorts in the country in 1968. It's also worth noting that one attraction at both Disneyland and Disney World, Country Bear Jamboree, was originally intended to be an après-ski attraction at Mineral King. Finally, Disney's attempt at a ski resort, along with the various legal challenges against it, had profound implications for the development of new ski resorts in the United States. Even though the Sierra Club lost in their initial 1972 case, the US Supreme Court's ruling established a precedent that environmental groups had standing to sue government agencies. These groups took full advantage of this standing, and many successful environmental-based lawsuits against the government today can trace their fundamentals back to this case. Ultimately, Disney's failure at a winter sports development marked a symbolic end to the era of developing massive destination ski resorts. Since the rise of these environmental lobbying organizations, the number of new ski resorts in the US has plummeted. In California, only one new ski resort, Mount Shasta Ski Park, has opened since the last attempt at a Disney ski resort ended in 1978, and this was effectively a replacement for Mount Shasta Ski Bowl, which was destroyed by an avalanche in the late 1970s. In fact, the last new large California ski resorts opened more than 50 years ago, when North Star and Kirkwood began their operations in 1972. If you look at fly-to destinations across the country, the last one to open was Deer Valley in 1981, meaning that no new serious ski resorts have opened in over 40 years. As winter sports continue to boom in popularity across the United States, overcrowding has become a hot topic of conversation. And while we as a society have become a lot more conscious about our impact on the environment over the past few decades, the question remains, what if there were just a few more resorts to spread out the crowds? Ultimately, Disney may be the reason why we don't have the answer. If you found this information helpful and want to see more videos like this during the off-season, be sure to like and subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss any of our content. For more information on over 100 ski resorts across the United States and elsewhere around the world, check out peakrankings.com. See you for the next one.